Hundreds of people were crossing the square when a sharp sound cracked through the air. A police officer had just struck a black woman selling roasted corn from an old cart, all because she had not moved it off the curb fast enough. Hot ears of corn rolled across the pavement in every direction. The crowd froze and simply watched. The officer wore a look of open contempt on his face. He had no idea that the very video capturing that slap would soon shake the entire city to its core. And the most devastating part was not that he would lose his badge. It was the discovery of who that poor corn seller truly was. Mist still clung to the tops of the buildings near the train station. Steam rose from vents in the sidewalk, mixing with the smell of coffee drifting out from a corner shop. Maren Ellison pushed her cart down the same route she had walked for years, her sneakers worn soft at the heels, her gloved hands steady on the handle. She reached her usual corner just as the first commuters began pouring out of the station, briefcases swinging, headphones in, eyes fixed on their phones. She set the brake on her cart, exhaled into the cold air, and got to work the way she always did. She wiped down every single ear of corn with a clean cloth before laying it on the grill, taking her time even when a line began to form. She built her coal fire in careful layers, blowing gently until the embers glowed orange and steady. She folded fresh towels beside her seasoning jars, lined up the butter, the chili powder, the lime wedges, everything exactly where her hands expected it to be. When the first customer stepped up, she smiled the way she smiled at everyone, like she had been waiting all morning just for them. Nearby vendors nodded at her as they set up their own carts, and a coffee seller 2 stalls down waved without needing to speak. Office workers from the glass tower across the street always seemed to find their way to her corner. A young accountant named Callan stopped by regularly, always ordering the same thing, always leaving an extra $1 in her jar without saying why. A receptionist named Lila liked to talk about her weekend, while Maren turned the corn slowly over the coals. None of them knew much about her beyond her name and her kindness, but that seemed to be enough for everyone who crossed her path. She rarely spoke about herself, and somehow no one ever thought to press her on it. When someone dropped a coin or fumbled with their wallet, she waited without a flicker of impatience, telling them to take their time. When a construction worker once cut in line by mistake, she simply handed him his change first and moved on. No scene, no complaint. She had a way of making the corner feel warmer than the weather allowed, and regulars often said the walk to her cart was the best part of their morning. She told anyone who would listen in her calm, unhurried voice that a decent day begins with treating people decently. It was not a lesson she preached. It was simply how she lived. Her apartment, 3 blocks away, held almost nothing extra. A single bed, a small table, a shelf of books with cracked spines, and a framed photograph turned face down in a drawer that nobody had ever seen. She paid her rent on time, kept her utility bills in a neat folder, and never once complained about the cold mornings or the long hours on her feet. Nobody in the neighborhood knew where she had come from before she arrived with that cart. Nobody asked, and she never offered, and the silence around her past sat there like a locked door nobody thought to knock on. Some evenings, after the cart had been scrubbed clean and the coals had gone cold, she walked home the long way, past the library, past the small park where old men played chess on stone tables. She never rushed those walks. She let herself notice things. A child chasing pigeons, a couple arguing quietly by a bus stop, an old woman feeding stray cats behind the grocery store. She had once lived a life where every hour was scheduled, every meeting logged, every decision weighed against 100 consequences. Now her evenings belonged only to her, and she guarded that simplicity the way other people guarded fortunes. If anyone asked why a woman her age spent winters standing over hot coals instead of resting, she only shrugged and said the work kept her honest. That day felt no different from 100 others. The smoke curling up into the gray sky, the corn turning gold on the grill, laughter rising from customers who lingered a little longer than they needed to. Then, without warning, a police cruiser rolled up and stopped directly in front of her cart, its tires bumping against the curb. The engine idled for a long moment before the door swung open. Maren glanced up, wiped her hands on her apron, and kept working because nothing had ever come from a patrol car stopping nearby. Officer Cole Brennan stepped out of the vehicle, already irritated before his boots hit the pavement. He had spent the previous hour being dressed down by his lieutenant over a botched report. The kind of humiliation that clung to a man's chest and refused to loosen. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the square for something, any scrap of anything he could control. He saw the cart tilted slightly onto the edge of the curb, the smoke drifting toward the sidewalk, and decided that was reason enough. He walked straight over, boots striking the pavement hard, and stopped a few feet from the cart. Maren looked up, expecting the usual nod that officers gave her on their rounds. Instead, Cole's voice came out sharp and clipped, cutting through the morning chatter. "Move this cart now." Maren wiped her hands again, glanced at the coals still glowing hot beneath the grate, and answered in the same steady tone she used with everyone. "Please, just give me a few minutes. The coals are still hot, and I don't want to burn anyone carrying it." It was a reasonable request, spoken without any edge at all. But Cole had already decided somewhere between the lieutenant's office and this corner that he needed someone to listen to him without question. He took her calm as defiance, her patience as an insult, and his voice rose loud enough that heads began turning across the square. People slowed their steps. A woman with a stroller paused near the newsstand. Two men in suits stopped mid-conversation to watch. Cole's volume climbed further, his finger jabbing toward the cart, words tumbling out about obstruction and disrespect, and rules that everyone else seemed to follow just fine. Maren did not raise her voice back. She did not step away either. She simply stood there, hands folded, meeting his anger with a stillness that seemed to make him even angrier, as though her calm was somehow another form of defiance he could not tolerate. The crowd grew thicker by the second, phones beginning to rise from pockets and bags. Callan, the accountant, had just arrived for his regular order and stood frozen near the back of the gathering group. Lila from the glass tower clutched her coffee cup, her knuckles whitening. Nobody said a word out loud, but the tension in the square had turned into something you could almost taste, sharp and metallic, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Cole's hand curled into a fist at his side, then released, then curled again. He stepped closer, close enough that his shadow fell across her face, and said something low that only she could hear. Maren did not flinch. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable, waiting for whatever came next. The way she had waited through countless difficult mornings in a life nobody around her fully understood. Somewhere behind him, a stranger muttered for him to calm down, but the words seemed to bounce off him without landing, as though his anger had built a wall too thick for reason to pass through. His breathing grew shallow, his fingers flexing at his sides, and the crowd around them seemed to sense that the moment had tipped past the point of simple words. And then, without another word of warning, Cole raised his hand into the cold air. The slap landed hard across Maren's face, the sound cracking through the square like a gunshot. Her head snapped sideways, her towel slipping from her shoulder and falling to the pavement. The cart rocked on its wheels, tipping just enough to send a dozen ears of corn tumbling off the grill and rolling across the concrete in every direction. For one long moment, nobody in the crowd made a sound. The steam from the fallen corn curled upward into silence, and even the pigeons near the fountain seemed to still. Then the phones came up, dozens of them, red recording lights blinking to life across the square. Cole stood over her, chest heaving, and instead of stepping back, instead of realizing what he had just done, he leaned in closer and spat out words meant to finish what his hand had started. "Useless," he said, loud enough for the cameras to catch every syllable. "You people never listen." The word hung in the cold air longer than it should have, ugly and unmistakable. Maren pressed a hand to her cheek for only a second, then let it fall. She did not shout back. She did not cry out for help or plead her case to the strangers filming around her. She knelt down slowly, one knee against the cold pavement, and began gathering the scattered ears of corn one at a time, wiping the dirt from each with the same careful patience she used every single morning of her life. Her silence said more than any outburst could have, and the crowd seemed to understand that even as they kept their phones raised. Near the edge of the gathering, a young woman named Quinn lowered her phone with trembling hands, staring at the video she had just captured. She had been walking to work, running slightly late, and had stopped only because of the shouting. Now she stood frozen, watching Cole straighten his jacket and glance around at the crowd, as though daring anyone to say something. Quinn's thumb hovered over her screen for a moment, her heart pounding, before she made her decision and pressed send, releasing the video into the world without knowing exactly what she was about to unleash. An older man, Nee Arbai, stepped forward and offered Maren his handkerchief, though she waved it away gently and kept working, gathering the last few ears of corn scattered near the base of a lamppost. Cole lingered a moment longer, perhaps waiting for an apology that would never come, perhaps waiting for the crowd to disperse and take the discomfort with it. Neither happened. Instead, more phones rose around him. More strangers stepped closer, and the silence that had followed, the slap slowly filled with the low murmur of disbelief. He finally turned and walked back toward his cruiser, his jaw set, refusing to look at anyone directly, as though refusing to see them meant they had not truly seen him either. The video crossed from one small circle of friends into a current that no one could hold back. It appeared first in group chats, then in local forums, then on every major platform at once. The same 9 seconds looping over and over, the slap, the corn rolling, the word useless hanging in the cold air. News desks across the city picked it up, cutting between the raw footage and stunned anchors trying to find the right words to describe what everyone had already seen with their own eyes. A hashtag formed almost overnight, spreading faster than anyone at the police department could track, calling for accountability, calling for answers, calling for the badge number stitched onto Cole's uniform in that grainy footage. Local television vans began appearing near the square, reporters standing in front of the very corner where the cart had tipped, describing a scene that had already become the only thing anyone in the city seemed to be talking about. Strangers who had never met Maren found themselves defending her, sharing her story, demanding to know her name. At the police department, Cole sat in the break room, scrolling through the same video everyone else was watching, his jaw tight, his leg bouncing under the table. He told himself it would pass the way so many things seemed to pass after a few days of noise. "It'll blow over," he muttered to another officer passing by, who only offered a tight, uncomfortable nod and kept walking. That officer did not linger to chat the way he normally would have, and Cole noticed the shift, even if he refused to name it out loud. More officers seemed to find reasons to avoid the break room whenever Cole sat down. Conversations quieted when he entered a room, then picked back up once he left, always about something else entirely. His lieutenant called him in for a private conversation that left Cole's face pale, though he emerged from the office repeating the same defense to anyone who would listen. "I was doing my job," he said over and over, as though repetition alone could make it true. The department announced an internal investigation, and Cole's badge, though not yet revoked, suddenly felt heavier on his chest than it ever had before. Reporters began calling the precinct directly, and a spokesperson was assigned to handle the flood of requests, reading the same careful statement to every outlet that phoned in. Community groups organized a gathering outside the station, holding signs that showed a still frame from the video. The corn scattered across the pavement, Marin's hand pressed to her cheek. Cole watched the coverage from his car one evening, parked several blocks from his own apartment, unwilling to walk past the small crowd of protesters he knew had gathered near his building. He told himself repeatedly that context mattered, that nobody understood the pressure of the job, that a single bad moment should not define a decade of service. But even as he repeated it, some quieter part of him had already begun to suspect that no explanation would be enough to undo what the footage had already shown the world. He stood in front of the mirror that evening, running his thumb over the metal shield pinned to his uniform, and told his own reflection the same thing he had been telling everyone else. He believed it, or told himself he did, even as the phone in his pocket kept buzzing with messages he refused to read. Then something happened that he had not expected at all. A man in a tailored gray coat walked into the small coffee shop near the square and asked quietly where he might find the woman who sold corn on the corner. Attorney Gideon Rhodes had not planned on visiting the city, but the video had reached him the same way it reached everyone else, through a screen, through a jolt of recognition that struck him like a physical blow. He watched it 3 times before he was certain, before the years fell away, and he saw past the gray in her hair and the weight of exhaustion in her shoulders. He knew that face. He had known it for years, long before either of them had gray hair or tired eyes, back when they had both fought battles that most people in this city had long since forgotten. He found her sitting on an overturned crate near her damaged cart, taping the wheel back into place with careful, practiced hands. She looked up at him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Then Gideon sat down across from her on the curb, exactly the way he used to sit across from her at meetings years earlier. And the two of them simply looked at each other. 2 old friends reunited by the worst possible circumstance. Slowly, quietly, pieces of a story began to surface that no one in the city had ever heard before. Years before she ever touched a cart or lit a single coal, Marin Ellison had been a name spoken with respect in rooms most people never entered. She had organized housing programs for families on the edge of losing everything, had sat across tables from officials twice her age, and refused to back down when they tried to dismiss her. She had spent years building bridges between struggling neighborhoods and the resources they had always been denied, working nights and weekends without ever asking for recognition. When she finally stepped back from that world, she did not vanish out of shame or defeat. She stepped back because she wanted, for the first time in her adult life, to build something small and honest with her own 2 hands, something that belonged only to her. Gideon remembered the exhaustion in her eyes near the end of those years, the toll it had taken to fight the same battles again and again with little to show beyond incremental progress. He remembered the farewell dinner a small group of colleagues had thrown for her, how she had thanked everyone but revealed nothing of what she planned to do next. Some had assumed she would resurface in another city, in another office, chasing another cause under a different title. None of them had imagined she would choose a street corner and a cart of corn, trading conference rooms for open air, trading committees for quiet mornings that belonged to no one but her. Gideon studied her face as she spoke, seeing the same steadiness that had made her formidable all those years ago, now wrapped in the quiet dignity of a woman who sold corn on a street corner. He leaned forward and asked the question that had been sitting on his tongue since he first saw the video. "Is it time," he said gently, "for people to know the truth?" Marin only smiled. The same small, knowing smile she had always given him whenever he pushed too hard toward an answer she wasn't ready to give. She did not respond right away. Instead, she looked out across the square at the flattened cardboard where her cart had tipped, at the faint marks still visible on the pavement where the corn had scattered. Gideon did not press further. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and made a call that set something larger into motion, something that would soon carry far beyond this single corner of the city. He remembered her from the early years, back when they had both sat in cramped basement offices, drafting proposals nobody in power wanted to read. She had been the one who kept pushing when everyone else grew tired, who found a way into rooms that had been closed to people who looked like them for generations. He remembered the night she told him she was stepping away from it all, not out of defeat, but out of a need to breathe air that did not smell like paperwork and compromise. He had not fully understood it then. Watching her now, kneeling in front of a battered cart on a cold city street, he thought. Perhaps he finally did. He arrived at the courthouse carrying a thick folder of documents. Records nobody had thought to ask for, records that were about to change everything. The internal investigation moved faster once the security footage was pulled from every angle around the square. Camera feeds from the train station, from the coffee shop, from the bank, across the street. Each recording told the same story from a different position, and none of them supported the account Cole had written in his official statement. He had claimed she resisted a lawful order. He had claimed she pushed him first, that his response had been necessary, controlled, professional. The footage showed none of that. It showed her hands folded. It showed her stillness. It showed his hand rising in the cold air with nothing behind it but rage. Detectives compared his written statement against his verbal account given hours later, and the two no longer matched in several key details. Where he had written that she raised her voice, witnesses described her speaking in the same calm tone throughout the entire encounter. Where he had written that a crowd had begun blocking traffic, traffic camera footage showed the street remained completely clear the whole time. Every piece of evidence chipped away at the version of events Cole had built until almost nothing of his story remained standing. Reporters obtained portions of the investigation through public records requests, and each new detail became its own headline, its own wave of outrage rippling back through the city. Newspapers ran side-by-side comparisons of his statement against the footage, highlighting every contradiction in red. Local news anchors read updates each evening with the same grim expression, describing a case that seemed to grow worse with every passing day. Editorial boards began writing about accountability, about patterns, about a badge that was supposed to mean protection instead of harm. Legal analysts appeared on evening broadcasts, breaking down each contradiction line by line, explaining to viewers exactly how far the official report had strayed from what the cameras had recorded. Former officers spoke anonymously to journalists, describing a culture where reports were sometimes shaped to protect a colleague rather than to reflect the truth. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding not just an internal review, but a broader look at how complaints against officers had been handled in years past. The pressure built steadily until it reached the office of the one person in the city whose voice could not be ignored. Mayor Corinne Vale called a press conference, television cameras crowding the steps of City Hall before she had even stepped up to the podium. She spoke carefully at first, acknowledging the investigation, promising transparency, the kind of measured language people expected from someone in her position. But then, unexpectedly, she said something that no one in the crowd anticipated. She said she knew the woman in that video personally, and that the city owed her far more than an apology. The room fell silent as Corinne stepped down from the podium and walked directly toward Marin, who had been quietly standing near the back of the gathered crowd. The mayor did not shake her hand. She wrapped her arms around her instead, in front of every camera, in front of every reporter scribbling furiously into their notebooks. The image would be printed on front pages. Two women embracing outside City Hall, one dressed in a tailored suit, the other still wearing her worn apron, dusted faintly with cornmeal. What the mayor said next changed the way the entire city understood the woman they had only recently learned to recognize. Long before City Hall knew her name attached to any title, Marin had quietly founded a community fund that helped thousands of struggling families find steady work and launch small businesses of their own. She had built it from nothing, refusing every offer of public recognition, declining awards, avoiding cameras, insisting the credit belonged to the families who did the work of rebuilding their own lives. When the fund had grown large enough to run without her, she had simply stepped away and let it continue, disappearing into an ordinary life that suited her far better than any spotlight ever could. The square fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Hundreds of people processing the truth all at once, somewhere near the back of the crowd, standing apart from everyone else. Cole Brennan stood frozen, his face drained of color, the weight of what he had done finally landing on him in full. He had struck a woman he believed to be powerless, a woman he had judged in a single glance and decided did not deserve patience or respect. Instead, he had struck someone who had quietly reshaped thousands of lives, and the entire city now knew it in the same breath they learned his name. Strangers who had walked past Marin's cart 100 times without a second glance now found themselves recalculating everything they thought they understood about the woman behind the grill. Some felt embarrassed, remembering moments when they had barely nodded at her, too distracted by their own mournings to notice the calm dignity she carried. Others felt something closer to shame, recalling the silence they had kept during the encounter itself, the way they had raised their phones instead of their voices. A local business owner who had once complained about her cart blocking foot traffic quietly deleted his old comments online, hoping no one would remember what he had written. The mayor's words had done more than reveal a name. They had forced an entire square full of people to examine how easily they had overlooked someone standing right in front of them. The formal hearing was scheduled, and by the time it began, the courtroom overflowed with more spectators than the building could comfortably hold. Television crews lined the hallway outside, their cameras aimed at the heavy wooden doors, broadcasting the proceedings live to a city that had not looked away from this story. Inside, Cole sat at the defense table in a stiff gray suit that did nothing to soften the exhaustion carved into his face. Across from him, Gideon Rhodes arranged his files with the calm precision of a man who had waited a long time for a moment exactly like this one. The questioning began methodically, each piece of evidence introduced one after another without pause. Gideon played the footage first, the same 9 seconds the entire city had already memorized, but now paired with additional angles no one had seen before, angles that left no room for interpretation. He followed it with the traffic camera recordings, then the bank's security footage, then written statements from 6 separate witnesses who had stood in that square and watched the same events unfold. Each piece landed like another brick, stacked against a wall that was quickly becoming impossible to climb. One witness, an elderly man who had sold newspapers near the same corner for years, testified in a trembling but steady voice about what he had seen. He described Marin's calm, her folded hands, the way she had answered every question without raising her voice even once. He described Cole's anger building long before the slap ever came, an anger that seemed to have nothing to do with the cart at all. When Gideon asked him why he had decided to come forward and testify, the old man simply said that he had watched that woman treat every person on that corner with respect for years, and it was time someone returned the favor. Cole's own attorney attempted to argue provocation, attempted to suggest that stress and department pressure had clouded his judgment in a single unfortunate moment. But every question Gideon asked in return dismantled that argument piece by piece until Cole sat there with nothing left to offer but silence. When finally asked directly whether he believed his actions were justified, Cole opened his mouth to answer and found no words waiting there at all. The courtroom watched him search for something, anything, and come up empty. Judge Aurelia Thorne listened through every hour of testimony without a single visible flicker of emotion, her expression steady, her attention absolute. When it came time to deliver her ruling, she spoke slowly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room without needing to rise. She said that no uniform, no badge, no title granted any person the right to place their hands on another human being out of anger or convenience. She said the law existed to protect the vulnerable from exactly this kind of abuse, not to shield those who wore it while committing that abuse. Her words landed with the weight of finality, each sentence closing another door that Cole had hoped might still remain open. She looked directly at him as she spoke her final lines, her gaze unwavering, and reminded the courtroom that authority without accountability was no authority at all. The room remained utterly still as she finished, the only sound, the faint hum of the ceiling lights above. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward, pens frozen above their notebooks, waiting to see whether Cole would offer any final words in his own defense. He said nothing. He simply stared at the table in front of him, his hands pressed flat against the wood as though trying to hold himself steady. Then, without additional ceremony, she ordered that his badge be surrendered on the spot, right there in the courtroom, in front of everyone who had gathered to witness the outcome. 2 officers stepped forward from the side of the room to formally collect it. Cole's hands trembled as he unpinned the metal shield from his chest, the same shield he had worn like armor for years, the same shield that had somehow convinced him he stood above the very people he was meant to serve. He placed it into the officer's waiting palm without meeting anyone's eyes, his shoulders curling inward as though trying to make himself smaller than the moment demanded. The courtroom did not erupt into applause or shouting. It simply sat in silence, watching a man lose the only identity he had built his entire life around, watching consequence finally arrive after years of assuming it never would. In the days that followed, Cole's life unraveled in ways he had never imagined possible. The department terminated him formally, and word of the case spread quickly enough that no other precinct in the region would consider his application. Neighbors who once waved to him now crossed the street to avoid conversation, and old friends stopped returning his calls one by one. He found himself sitting alone in an apartment that had grown unbearably quiet, replacing the sound of a life that had once felt so certain and so secure. He applied for work at a security firm, then a warehouse, then a rental car counter near the airport. And each time the interview ended, the moment his name registered on the other side of the desk, he stopped watching the news entirely, unable to bear seeing his own face appear again beside a headline he already knew by heart. His mother called once a week, her voice careful and searching, never quite finding the right question to ask a son she barely recognized anymore. Late at night, he would sometimes drive past the square without meaning to, slowing near the corner where the cart still stood, though he never once found the courage to stop the car. Meanwhile, across town, something entirely different was unfolding at the corner near the train station. Word of who Marin truly was had spread through every neighborhood, carried by the same speed that had once spread the video of her being struck. Now people lined up at her cart, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to reverence, waiting patiently even when the line stretched halfway down the block. They did not come out of pity. They came because they finally understood the quiet strength that had always stood behind her calm expression, and they wanted, in their own small way, to honor it. City officials proposed expanding the community fund she had built years earlier, offering to attach her name to it formally, promising resources and recognition that had never come her way the first time around. Reporters lined up requesting interviews, publishers offering to help her tell her story to a wider audience than she had ever imagined reaching. She turned down every personal donation offered to her directly, gently but firmly, insisting that any support belonged to the families the fund was meant to serve, rather than to herself. All she ever asked in return, whenever anyone pressed her for a statement, was that people simply try to treat one another with a little more kindness. She kept the cart in the same spot, refusing offers to relocate her to a storefront with her name painted across the window. Callan still came by regularly, though now he had to arrive earlier to beat the growing line. Lila brought her co-workers from the glass tower, treating the walk to the corner as something closer to a small pilgrimage than a coffee break. Marin noticed the change in how people looked at her, the added weight in their eyes, and she tried in her quiet way to remind them that nothing about her had actually changed. She was still the same woman who wiped down every ear of corn before it touched the grill. Still the same woman who folded towels the same way every single morning. The city slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though something in the air near that corner had shifted permanently. Then, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the square, walking slowly, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Cole stood there for a long moment before finally approaching the cart, his steps hesitant, his eyes fixed on the ground rather than on the woman standing behind the grill. He stopped a few feet away, the same distance he had stood on that terrible afternoon, though everything about him seemed different now. His shoulders had lost their old rigidity. His voice, when it finally came, barely rising above the sound of the wind moving through the square. He lowered his head and told her plainly that he was sorry. Not the hollow apology he had once offered to a camera, but something raw and unfiltered that seemed to cost him everything to say out loud. For the first time in his life, he understood that the weight of a badge had never come from the power it granted him. It had come from the responsibility he had been trusted to carry, a responsibility he had thrown away in a single careless moment. Marin said nothing for a long while, studying his face the way she studied everyone who approached her cart, searching for something honest beneath the surface. The silence stretched long enough that a few passers-by slowed their steps, curious, though neither of them seemed to notice the small audience gathering nearby. Finally, she reached down, selected an ear of corn still warm from the coals, and held it out to him without a word of judgment attached to the gesture. Cole stared at it for a moment before accepting it with both hands, as though it weighed far more than it should have. "Everyone makes mistakes," she told him, her voice as steady as it had always been, carrying none of the anger he had braced himself to receive. "What matters is who you choose to become after." The words settled over him quietly, without any performance behind them, exactly the way she had lived her entire life. Cole's eyes filled, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon, he let himself feel the full weight of everything he had lost and everything he might still be able to rebuild. He turned and walked away slowly, the warm corn still cupped in his hands, disappearing into the flow of the crowd moving through the square. A few onlookers who had gathered near the edge of the cart exchanged glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed, unsure whether it counted as forgiveness or simply the first small step toward it. Marin did not explain herself to any of them, and none of them asked. She had never needed an audience to know what she believed, and she did not need one now to prove it. Marin watched him go for a moment before turning back to her grill, laying another ear of corn carefully across the coals, the smoke curling upward into the cold afternoon sky, exactly as it had every single day before. The cart remained right there on the corner, unmoved, unshaken, a fixed point in a city that had learned something about itself it would not soon forget. People continued to stop throughout the afternoon, drawn by the familiar smell of roasted corn drifting across the square, some regulars, some strangers, who had only recently learned her name. They came not only for the taste, though the taste remained as good as it had always been, but for something harder to name, something they carried with them long after they walked away. When the noise of the story had finally quieted and the city had moved on to other headlines, The corner still held the same rhythm it always had. Maren still arrived before sunrise, still lit her coals the same careful way, still smiled at every stranger the way she had always smiled at everyone. Somewhere across town, Cole had taken a job stocking shelves at a hardware store, small and unremarkable, the kind of work that asked nothing of him but honesty and effort. He never became a regular at her cart, but every few weeks he found his way back to that corner, always keeping a respectful distance, always leaving without saying much. It was enough, it seemed, simply to remember what he had learned there, and to try, one ordinary day at a time, to become someone worthy of it. They remembered in that quiet corner of the city that kindness had outlasted cruelty, that patience had outweighed power, and that dignity, in the end, had never needed a title to prove itself real. Status might make people fear you for a moment, but only fairness and compassion can earn their respect for a lifetime.